Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us again. Some of you might know that this is my second attempt at making this presentation. So I just want to give you a heads up. If this time around there's going to be a technical glitch, I am going to switch off the PowerPoint and I'm going to come back on the video. My presentation is image heavy and it has a video as well, and therefore it can be a little bit of a problem in the streaming. We changed the time this time around to 3 o'clock, hoping that we will not have any technical glitches. So keeping my fingers crossed, I think I am going to start my presentation. You can actually see the topic that I will be speaking on, which is Delhi's UNESCO World Heritage Site and Introduction. Two things important to note here, that I am only talking about Delhi's UNESCO World Heritage Sites, not that we have any other kind of World Heritage Sites, but I'm only going to talk about the three sites or structures that you can see right in front. And I am not going to go into the details of all the structures within these complexes. I am going to concentrate only on the three big structures that you see right in front of you. I'm not detailing out everything that exists within the complexes. Now, before I actually get down to the three World Heritage Sites of Delhi, I think it's important to understand how UNESCO comes into being and what is the World Heritage Convention. Now, post the Second World War, there was an urgent need which was felt to form an international organization which could take care of the scientific, cultural, educational aspects around the globe. And that organization was called as the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, which was founded in November 1945. September of the same year was when the Second World War ended, and you can see the sense of urgency to start off an organization. It takes almost a decade and a half for actually the World Heritage Convention to take place, and a little more than 1.5 decades. And the World Heritage Convention takes place in 1972. The first of it takes place in 1972. But there were events that happened much before 1972 which actually led to the formation of the World Heritage Convention, followed by the committee, and the formation of something known as the World Heritage Sites listing. Now, the photos that you see right in front of you are actually of a temple known as the Abu Simbel temples, which are actually from the Egyptian civilization. Now, in 1959, Sudan and Egypt approached UNESCO with a concern that these temples would soon be drowned under the water of a lake called Lake Nasir, which was going to be created because of the construction of the Aswan Dam on the Nile River. And there was an urgent need for the protection of these temples that was felt, and that's when it was decided that these temples are going to be relocated to a different site altogether. So the two photos that you see on the slide, the one on the left hand side, and probably you can see my cursor moving on the photo. So that is how the original temple looked like on its original site. There is a rocky outcrop at the back and it was carved onto it. On the right hand side, what you see is actually part of the relocation process. So these temples from this side on the left hand side were relocated onto the site on the right hand side, and you can actually see a machinery on the bottom left of the second photo, and it actually gives you an idea about the scale of the structures. Now so this is a photo where on the left hand side you can see the relocated temple. That is how it stands right now, on higher ground away from Lake Nazir. And on the right hand side, you can see the photo of when the process was still undergoing. What happens is that I'm going to go back to the first slide again. What you can see here in the original temple is that this is a natural feature right here, which has been cut into to form these temples. The photo that you see here, you can see the sky at the back, and that's when you realize that the backdrop here is completely reconstructed. All of this at the back is reconstructed to form the shape of the temple as it would have existed in its original site. And you can see in the second photo right here how they would have transported the entire temple from its original site to the relocation site. You can see they had cut off these pieces, and it's literally like a jigsaw puzzle being put back into its place in the new site. So this was a very large project. This is not the only temple that was relocated. There were other smaller temples in the area that were relocated. If I'm not mistaken, there were 3 to 4 other temples which were relocated. And therefore it was not a single temple project. This particular temple took about 10 to 11 years for its total completion. And Egypt this year celebrated 40 years of relocation of these temples. So it was a long drawn process. All the 4 temples that were relocated took about 20 years for its completion. Now what this relocation did was, and this was not the only example, we have other examples elsewhere in the world also where the international community sort of came together for the protection of cultural sites. For example, in Venice, for Venice as a city and its lagoons, and the archaeological remains of Mohenjo-daro as well. What this project did for the world is it brought a lot of countries together. At that point in time, 80 million US dollars were used for the relocation of all these temples. 50% of that amount was actually collected as funds and donations from 50 countries across the world. And therefore it was understood that not only one country or 2 countries, but a lot of countries were concerned about cultural heritage across the globe and wanted to do something about its preservation, conservation, and protecting it basically. Now, before 1972, another trend that was ongoing was the fact that there were organizations and there were groups that were concentrating on the conservation and protection of cultural sites, or they were looking at the conservation or protection of natural sites. There were 2 different groups of thought and groups of people who were working in these 2 directions. 1972, when the World Heritage Convention takes place, it's actually the first time that both these aspects of protection and conservation are brought together under a single umbrella. And therefore, when the World Heritage Convention takes place, they decide to bring together the conservation of natural heritage as well as of cultural heritage under one umbrella. Now, the World Heritage Committee sessions happen each year. They are scheduled usually, the first session of the year is in June, July, and the next of evaluation is usually held during the later part of the year in November, December, which includes the site visit. We have had 43 sessions of the World Heritage Committee so far, and the 44th session is scheduled this year on 29th June till 9th July in China. I don't know what the status of that is currently, but as of now, it's still on for June, July this year in China. The 7th session that happened in 1983 was very important for India because it was this session that our first site was enlisted or inscribed into the World Heritage Sites listing, which was the Ajanta Caves. In the same session, there were 3 other sites, which were the Ellora Caves, Taj Mahal, and Agra Fort were inscribed on that list. So these were actually the first 4 sites to be inscribed onto the list from India. It was the 17th and the 31st session, which was very important for Delhi, because the 17th session in 1993 was when the Qutub Minar and the Humayun's tomb were inscribed onto our list of the World Heritage Sites. And the 31st session, which was held in 2007, was when the Red Fort was inscribed onto the list. Now, when I talk of a session and inscription into the list, it's necessary to try and understand what the process is. It's not a quick process. It's not it is a lengthy, it's a very detailed out project. Usually when UNESCO is inscribing sites onto the World Heritage list, of course, the universal value of the site is very important. But also what is important is the management plan of that particular site. These sites need to already have an existing management plan so that the UNESCO team can sort of coordinate with them and be in conversation with a already existing management team, help them, guide them, and take it forward. If there is no management plan already in place, there is no management in place for a particular site, it's very difficult for UNESCO to actually consider that site for its inscription either on the tentative list or on the main list. Now, the process is such that state parties file in the nomination for from their countries for sites under cultural or natural sites, and they are going to detail out if they are filing in the nomination for the tentative list or the main list for World Heritage Sites. Now, in the sessions that happen in June and July, the discussion takes place, the evaluation of this nomination dossier is looked into, the filing of the form is looked into, the management plan is evaluated. So this is not an on-site evaluation that's taking place. This happens at a location where everybody comes, the member states come, they discuss each and every application, look at the issues at it, raise those issues to state parties. It is in November and December when we actually have the committee visit sites to evaluate the nomination, to try and understand if the management plan is in place, if the conservation is up to mark, if it fulfills all the criteria, if the buffer zone area or the buffer area, demarcation of boundary walls, all of those things are in place. So there's a lot of aspects which need to be considered and which need to be looked into during a site visit and the evaluation that takes place. Once the committee does that visit and evaluates all of that, the session that happens next year is when the re-evaluation of the form takes place. By that time, usually the state parties are given enough recommendations and enough discussions happen that you need to upgrade in a particular manner if it is not fulfilling the criteria and things like that. And then finally the decision making takes place in the June-July session, whether they are going to disregard an application or put it into tentative list or delist a site or inscribe a site onto the main list. So it's a long drawn process, and that's the reason why you can see that in the 31st session in 2007 is when the Red Fort is actually inscribed onto the World Heritage Site. The filing in of its nomination had already been done much earlier, and it's just that the upgradation, the maintenance and issues that the UNESCO team was raising had to be met, and therefore it takes it much longer for it to kind of get inscribed into the list. Coming to the idea of the criterias, I've listed down 10 criterias. These are, as of now, they're hard and fast, but these are also evolving criterias. What I mean to say is these are not the same criterias that existed back in the 1970s or 1980s, because the world is changing. There are lots of reasons and ideas that are changing, and that is the reason why these criterias, these selection criterias are constantly upgraded. Till a couple of years back, you only had 6 criterias under which you had to list your cultural sites. Currently, there are a set of 10 criteria under which your cultural and natural sites need to fulfill the need to fall under. Sorry. Now, in this slide, and I hope you can see the slide, I have colored number 2, 3, 4, and 6. Now, the reason why they have been colored in red, they're in red, because these 4 criteria are the most important for us in terms of the 3 World Heritage Sites in Delhi. So the Qutub Minar actually forms under the 4th criteria. The 4th criteria is the only one under which the Qutub Minar is inscribed. So it says, to an outstanding example of a type of building, architectural or technological ensemble or landscape which illustrates significant stages in human history. So that's the criteria under which Qutub Minar is enlisted. Humayun's tomb falls under criteria 2 and 4, and I'm not going to read now because it's going to take much longer. You can read the slide yourself, but I'll just let you know. Humayun's tomb is under 2 and 4, and Red Fort falls under 2, 3, and 6. So Red Fort falls under 3 criteria, and that's how it's inscribed onto the World Heritage Site. Your sites need to fall under one or more categories that have been listed right in front of you, and that is one of the most important reason. The other thing about World Heritage is that, as the name is self-explanatory, it's World Heritage Sites. Sites in a particular geographical area or within a current political boundary, but not only important for people in that particular region or that particular country, it should have some value for people across borders, for across in any other part of the world, and that's how it's called as World Heritage Sites. Now, why is World Heritage Sites, or if having your sites inscribed on the World Heritage list, such a coveted thing, such an important thing? Why are people discussing all of this? There are multiple reasons. One thing is that if your site is listed onto the World Heritage Sites list, there is a certain level of maintenance that is required. That means there is better there's better taking care of the structures, there is better upgradation of facilities, there is better conservation work, and better visibility as well. In a country, we might know what the Qutub Minar is, and it might a lot of us might feel really proud of the Qutub Minar or associate with it or find it as a source of knowledge, inspiration, so on and so forth. But a lot of people across the world might have no idea what a Qutub Minar is. Why is it here in the middle of nowhere? Nobody might know that it's the tallest standing stone structure or stone minaret in the world. So it can have a huge amount of connotations. Now, we are not staying in a vacuum. There is constant change that's happening around us, and that is precisely the reason why there is always connections with which the monuments help us understand, and nature also helps us understand. So what World Heritage also does is the listing actually puts a site or a country up on a map and makes it easier for people to know about it, visit that place, and probably do better research as well. So World Heritage Sites, that's why are so popular. I mean, everybody who is in Delhi or has ever come to Delhi will surely agree with me with the fact that Delhi usually is kind of a stopover for a lot of people who are traveling into the country. They don't spend many days, though Delhi is a city of multiple cities, and there is so much to see, not only in terms of cultural heritage, but in terms of everything else also. We have fabulous museums, we have beautiful archaeological parks, but most people who are coming to Delhi at least will have either Qutub Minar or Humayun's tomb on their list. Some people will also have the Red Fort on their list. A lot of people as visitors miss out going to the Red Fort because it is a really large complex. It takes a lot of time, and because Delhi is sort of seen as a stopover for a lot of people who are traveling here, they try and avoid the Red Fort or just drive past the Red Fort. Now, I have a video to show to you, and the next slide is a video. I hope you can see it. I'm just going to change the slide now, and I will speak to you once the video is done.
In order to learn from the devastation and destruction of the two world wars, to promote understanding between peoples, and to secure peace, UNESCO was founded in 1945 as the Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization of the UN. A remarkable event strengthened further international cooperation. Following the construction of a dam in the 1960s, the ancient temples of Abu Simbel were literally on the verge of sinking. An international rescue mission prevented this by dismantling the monuments and rebuilding them on higher ground. This successful project raised awareness about the fact that all over the world there are places that are of outstanding value to all mankind and which therefore must be protected from threats such as armed conflict, deliberate destruction, economic pressure, natural disasters, and climate change. The idea of the World Heritage was born. In 1972, the first member states of UNESCO signed the World Heritage Convention and committed to preserving natural and cultural monuments and sites of outstanding universal value on their territory. For a site to be included in the World Heritage List, it must first be nominated by the country in which it was located. The nomination is examined by international experts who decide whether the inclusion in the list is justified. Finally, the World Heritage Committee, a body of 21 elected states, takes a vote. World Heritage Sites shows the diversity of cultures and natural phenomena that are tangible evidence of the bond between human beings and nature. The UNESCO World Heritage contributes to the preservation of these remarkable places and to promoting cultural exchange, dialogue, and peace in a sustainable way.
So, that was a short video that was prepared by the Austrian Commission for UNESCO, and I think it sums up very nicely what I just spoke to you through all the slides before that. Now, all the photos and all the videos that you see, this is the only video actually, the video that you saw and all the other photos that you're going to see in the presentation, they are all available online and from online sources like British Library. Some of them have been, the maps have been taken from Google, and this video is available on YouTube. So if anybody wants to use it, the only color photos that I will show you later are from a book that I have. Now that I've given you a bit of an understanding about the UNESCO process of inscribing monuments, sites, cultural and natural sites onto its list, I'm going to come down to the three structures or three sites that are enlisted from Delhi. And you can see the name of all the three. You had already seen the photos earlier. So we have the Qutub Minar and its surrounding structures. You have Humayun's tomb and you have the Red Fort complex. Now, I'm going to start with the Qutub Minar and we are going to chronologically progress in terms of history as well. So it's going to be easier for you to understand. Now, though you can, that's a map of the Qutub complex, and if you have been to the Qutub Minar complex and if you have seen photos, you would realize that there are multiple structures within it. Here also, excuse me, you can see a lot of numbers. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. These are the bigger structures which are actually marked on the map. I will not be speaking about all. I will give you an overview of the complex, but the two structures that I will be talking about predominantly are the first structures in this complex, which is this right here, which is the Quwwatul Islam Mosque, and that here is the Qutub Minar itself. Now, as per the intact listing, there are almost 24 structures within this complex, individual structures which are listed. So you can imagine the kind of variety that is present in this complex. I really like the Qutub complex for multiple reasons. A couple of things is that it has some of the earliest structures in it, but within this complex actually you can see the progression starting from the 12th century going all the way to the 19th century. This structure here, the small little structure, and that's our entrance. This is where, if you can see my cursor on the right bottom corner of the photo, that's usually the entry point, and you can usually see this arch right in front. That's actually what remains of the gateway of a sarai that existed. Now this is a Mughal sarai that exists right here. On the right hand side this corner there is a mosque which was part of the Mughal sarai, and you have other colonial structures as well. So starting from the 12th century you have structures going all the way up to the 19th century. So it produces a fairly good sort of a point to give people an understanding of the multi-layered history of Delhi. Now coming to the Quwwatul Islam Mosque and the Qutub Minar itself, before I get down to explaining to you what both these structures are and the different nuances of both these structures, it's important to understand what's happening in this part of Delhi. Now we are in the southern part of Delhi when we are looking at the Qutub complex, and when you look at the map of Delhi, this is in what is now currently known as South Delhi. And this is where the majority of the people were staying from the 8th to the 12th, 13th century. This is predominantly where the population is. This was part of Prithviraj Chauhan's Kila Rai Pithoda, which was an extension of an earlier Tomar fortification called Lal Kot. Now, Muhammad Ghori, who was an invader coming in from a place called Ghazni in Afghanistan, defeated Prithviraj Chauhan, took over this area, and as an invader, what he did differently than his predecessors was the fact that he put a commander here in Delhi. And he, these expeditions to come and loot a country, take back the loot and go back with the men and the resources and everything was quite an expensive sort of an expedition for most of them. It was difficult to gather so many men, the horses, the animals, and then make sure that nobody dies en route, there is no diseases or people don't fall ill. So these were usually quite expensive. And it's the first time that you actually see somebody leaving a commander behind and saying that, expedition was very expensive, but why not leave a commander behind who can actually generate some amount of revenue from this area and keep sending it back to Ghazni. And that's the reason why Qutbuddin Aibak was stationed here in Delhi. Muhammad Ghori, when he's on his way to Ghazni, he dies en route, and Qutbuddin Aibak is the first person to know about his death, and therefore he declares himself independent. Now, the moment he declares himself independent, there is a big dilemma, because he was not here to rule. He was just here to collect revenue and probably camp and collect revenue and so on and so forth. Now, suddenly he has declared himself independent. He has to construct a capital, so to say. He has to construct a mosque where the khutbah is going to be read, which declares him as the emperor of this area. Plus, he has to make sure that the entire population there is actually going to trust him and not look at him as just another person invading and looting and plundering and going back. And therefore, what happens is the first structure to be commissioned here is the Quwwatul Islam Mosque. Some historians say that the original name of the mosque was Quwwatul Islam Mosque, as in Sanctuary of Islam, and over a period of time it became Quwwatul Islam Mosque, which means Might of Islam. Currently we refer to it as the Quwwatul Islam Mosque. If you have visited it, you know how big it is, how detailedly carved the columns are. If you haven't, you can go back and have a look at some photos online. I will be showing you some older photos as well right now. Now, that of course is a photo of the Qutub Minar, which I am going to come back to in a bit. I'm going to take you to this slide. Now, these two photos that you see are of the northern colonnade of the Quwwatul Islam Mosque. So I'll just take you back to the map. This corridor that you see right here, colonnade in this area, that's the photo from here. So this is from the eastern to the western direction, and this is western to the eastern direction. So you can see it's the same colonnade from the same direction. What you see here is these are really profusely carved columns all along right here till about this point. The last two columns in this photo are pretty plain, and you can see them right here. These are the plain columns that you can see on the photo on the right hand side. So towards the end of this colonnade, you can actually see the plain columns. Now, it has been inscribed on the mosque that 27 temples, the material from the 27 temples that existed in this area has been reused to construct this mosque. There are multiple reasons for it. The first thing is, like I had mentioned, Qutbuddin Aibak really didn't come here to rule. He came here to stay for a bit, generate some revenue, and probably go back to Ghazni. But he was presented with an opportunity to declare himself independent as a ruler, and therefore desperately needed to construct things, especially the mosque, first of all. What happens is, all of this stone that you see is known as Delhi quartzite stone. It's one of the hardest stones known, and that's why carving on it is quite difficult. It is time consuming and it is difficult, and you have to imagine that whoever is the carver is actually just using a chisel and a hammer to carve out everything that you see right now. The temples that existed there provided an easy source of material, and that is the reason the temples were broken down, and all of that material was reused for the construction of the mosque that you see right here. The other thing that you will see is, if you look at the photo on the right hand side, for example, if you just look at these three columns, you will notice that none of the three columns are similar, and abruptly this center point for the first, second, third, fourth might be at the same level, and suddenly for the fifth one it goes higher, and sixth one it gets even higher. The reason being that originally when the temples were being used in the columns were being used in temples, this would have probably been the height from where then the tribute arch would sort of begin. So they have stacked up two columns to actually get the height that you see right here. The other thing, it was so easy to destruct a temple and actually construct a mosque here is because these are all set by the interlocking system. So these are all pieces of stones which are set on each other. The stone itself is so heavy, and it really can't move because there's going to be some superstructure construction over it, so it's not moving anywhere whatsoever until and unless it's dismantled, and you can dismantle it very nicely and reuse it elsewhere also. And that is exactly what is happening now. What's happening is also when rulers are patronizing temples are also viewed as sources to validate a ruler's rule. And therefore, if a ruler can't protect his temples, that means he also cannot protect his rule. Saying in a very layman's language, but that's exactly how it is. And the destruction of temples was not something that you see for the first time here. It has happened earlier also, but the destruction of a temple basically is indicative of the fall of the ruler as well, and has happened before this, but this is probably one of the most large scale representations of it. So you have the Quwwatul Islam mosque that you have. This is another view of the mosque. This is in the southeast corner that you have, and you can see the Qutub Minar right at the back. The other direction here on the right hand side, the image that you see is just behind the western central arch. So in the mosque you have the western wall which has the arches, and this is said to be the Garbhagriha of the Vishnu temple that would have existed right here. Again, if you visit the site right now, you will see that a lot of these temples, a lot of these columns don't exist. Only these columns exist right here. This is an open space with very few columns existing right here. All of these photos are from the late 1800s, early 1900s that you can see right here. Okay, now before I actually I want to go back to this map here. What you also see here is, so this is the colonnade that I showed you. Then I showed you this corner right here and the area behind the arch. What you see here right in front in the courtyard of the mosque is an iron pillar. Now it's from the 4th century BC and it is absolutely fabulous because it is a pure iron column which is standing out there in the open and not rusting. And that is the USP, you can say, of that column, that in the 4th century BC when it was being constructed, they knew exactly how to construct a pure iron column that would not rust. You can read more about it. There's a lot of information available on it, about the inscriptions that you have right there as well. Now coming to the Qutub Minar itself. So I explained to you the Qutub Mosque first, the Quwwatul Islam Mosque first, because this is an earlier construction compared to the Qutub Minar. This is constructed in 1192, if I'm not mistaken, and the Qutub Minar is constructed in 1202. So the Qutub Minar is the second construction. Now there are multiple conjectures about the Qutub Minar, and I will share all with you, and you can choose which one you want to agree with or disagree with. The first one is that it's believed that it's a Hindu structure which was constructed by Prithviraj Chauhan, which already existed in this place, and Qutbuddin Aibak constructed other structures around it. I disagree with it, and I will come back to why I disagree with it. Second is that there is a very important Chishtiya Sufi saint who is buried in the Mehroli area, who is known as Qutbuddin Bakhtiyar Kaki, and some people say that this is like a tower which is being constructed to sort of pay respect to him, and sometimes mentioned as Qutub Sahab ki lat or Qutub Sahab's staff as well. The third conjecture is that this is a minaret which is attached to the Quwwatul Islam Mosque for the azans to be given out from, to call the followers to come for prayer. Now this minaret is approximately 72 or 75 meters high, and you can imagine how large the first floor is going to be, and they didn't have any loudspeakers at that point in time. So to imagine somebody going up the first floor to the balcony and yelling out for people to come for prayers doesn't make any sense at all. The other thing is that if it was attached to the mosque, there would have been some symmetry in its location, and it would have been much closer to the building as well. So it definitely is not a tower. I don't agree to the fact that it is probably a minaret attached to the mosque. Now the fourth conjecture is that it is a victory tower, and I agree with that fact. And the reason why I agree with that fact is because we do have an example of a similar victory tower, or rather a tower in a different part of the world. Now that tower is known as the Minaret of Jam, and it is in Afghanistan. It is one of the two sites which is a World Heritage Site from Afghanistan. It is a brick minaret which looks very similar to the Qutub Minar, and you can actually read more about it on the UNESCO website. There is a river which runs, which is the river Jam, and it's constructed right besides the river Jam. Now a lot of these people, the invaders who were coming into India, would actually be coming in through that route, and they would have seen it, and therefore it makes complete sense that they recreated something like that right here. Now the Qutub Minar itself, the core masonry, internally it has Delhi quartzite that has been used, and what you see from the outside is all cladding of stone, which is red sandstone, which is a much softer stone, and that's why you see a lot of carving on the on the stone. You have a lot of verses from the Quran, a lot of floral motifs, a lot of geometrical patterns. You have the balconies. Just below the balconies, you have very detailed underside of the balconies as well. So that is how. So I believe that it is a victory tower constructed by Qutbuddin Aibak, and the inspiration is coming in from the minaret of Jam. Now, when Qutbuddin Aibak started the construction, he could only finish the first floor. He died, and his son-in-law actually and his successor continued the construction upwards till the fourth floor. So originally the Qutub Minar had 4 floors. Only the first floor was attributed to Qutbuddin Aibak. Second, third, and fourth were completed by Iltutmish. The fourth floor was struck by lightning and it was damaged. If you currently look at it, the fourth and there is a fifth floor also now. So the fourth and the fifth floor has some amount of white in it. You can see the color white. That's marble that was put in place there by Firoz Shah Tughlaq when he actually restored the tower. And while he was restoring the fourth floor, he said, might as well add something in my name. So he added the fifth floor, and this canopy that you see was actually put up there by the British and brought down later. So this would have been on top of this minaret right here in the center, which is brought down later. I'm sure at least some of you who are watching the talk right now or will be watching it later have seen the Qutub Minar or the Qutub complex currently, and you will recognize that this mound does not exist anymore. So the canopy actually is at the same level of the Qutub Minar, but in this corner, actually not this corner also, we are I think almost inside the Mehrauli Archaeological Park right now. It's on the same level as the Qutub Minar, but in this corner of the Qutub complex. If I am not mistaken, this is the Alai Darwaza, which is built by Alauddin Khilji, and at the back what you see is Adam Khan's tomb. Adam Khan's tomb, which is popularly known as Bhul Bhulaiya, which is part of the Mehrauli village right now. The Mehrauli bus terminal is just in front of this structure. Currently, it's so difficult to actually see all of these sites thanks to all the building construction that you see all around in this place. Okay, so I think that was about the Qutub complex. Here are some photos from a book called The Golden Calm, and you can see what I have just explained to you. You can see the Alai Darwaza right here very clearly. Back here is the incomplete minaret of Alauddin Khilji, which is known as the Alai Minar. He wanted to construct a structure double the size of Qutub Minar. Okay, coming to the second World Heritage Site, and I am running late as expected. So Humayun's Tomb Complex. The best thing about the Humayun's Tomb Complex is when you visit the site, Humayun's tomb itself is the last structure that you see in the complex. Humayun's tomb is the World Heritage Site. Everything else that is in the complex is in there thanks to the buffer zone around the World Heritage Site. So this structure here, this octagonal tomb, predates Humayun's tomb, and that is known as Isa Khan's tomb, sorry. This is Isa Khan's tomb. This is Bu Halima's garden and tomb. That's Bu Halima's gateway. This is Arab Ki Sarai, and this is the western entrance gate to Humayun's tomb, and this is the southern entrance gate to Humayun's tomb. Now, Humayun, when he becomes the ruler, he rules for a decade, and then for 15 years he is ousted from India by Sher Shah Suri. Now, when he comes back after 15 years, it's seen as a huge exodus of people because he was in Persia, and the Persian ruler at that point in time kept on telling him that he needs to go back to India and take what belongs to him and what belongs to his forefathers. And therefore, when he comes back, it's believed that he told his wife that if you ever construct a structure for me, it should be similar to that of what you see in Isfahan and those areas, basically, of my forefathers. And therefore, in this map itself, you can see the stark difference of the plan of Isa Khan's tomb and Humayun's tomb itself. Now, Humayun's tomb, that's another photo that you have here. Now, very different from what you can recollect of Humayun's tomb right now. What you have right in front of you, this structure is the western gateway of the Humayun's tomb complex. Right behind this platform and this big dome is Humayun's tomb. That is Babur's tomb, Naika Maqbara, not Babur, his father. His father is buried in Kabul. That is Neela Gumbad, sorry, at the back. And the river would have been right behind, Yamuna, right at the back. And in this direction, on the right hand side, would have been the southern gateway to Humayun's tomb. Now, Humayun's tomb is quite fabulous because you can see the kind of gardens here. Now, as per the Quran, it says heaven is in the form of garden and there are 4 rivers flowing through it. And that was the imagery that was taken by the Mughals and actually implemented in all their garden tombs. And Humayun's tomb actually sets in motion this idea of square tombs set in the center of a garden or set at the at one end of the garden. Now, what's happening is this garden style is also known as the Char Bagh garden. Char means 4 and Bagh means garden, and that's what you can see. This entire garden is a square garden which has been divided by waterway and walkways, and Humayun's tomb is set right in the center of this garden. You can keep dividing the garden as much as you want for as long as you want. This is the kind of division that you have right here. The other thing is that when you're visiting Humayun's tomb or when you're looking at photos of Humayun's tomb, please ignore the grass that you see right now. Please ignore the lawn. There was no concept of lawns. There was a concept of gardens, which meant you would have had a lot of trees, shrubs, flowering plants, fruit-bearing trees, and that would be densely vegetated all around in this garden. I'm just trying to think of an example. The current example that you can really think of is if you've visited Ahmaduddaullah's tomb in Agra. When you enter, similarly like this, you have the gateway, and the moment you cross the gateway into the complex, on both the sides, as part of conservation work, these gardens have been replanted to look like gardens that would have existed during the time of the Mughals and when the tombs were being constructed. Now, Humayun's tomb is actually on a plinth. This is a base or a plinth, and it has 17 arches on either sides. All of these 17 arches are leading you into chambers where there are other family members who are buried. The structure is known as Humayun's tomb. It was constructed for him. He is the person who is buried right under the dome in the central chamber, but it was planned as a family burial, and therefore more than 150 members of the Mughal royal family are actually buried here. And whenever you visit next, or if you see photos on the plinth, you will be able to see the gravestones of a lot of people who are actually buried in there. These small little structures that are known as chhatris, you see them just above the corner chambers. On this level, on the tomb level, that is exactly where his closest family members are buried. Daughters, wife, sons, brothers, so on and so forth. So the closest family members are buried in these 4 chambers right around in this area. Now, the last thing here is this structure. This is a gateway, and if you would recollect again, if you've been there, or you can do a search, it is known as Arab Ki Sarai, and this sarai would not have been for travelers. This would actually have been for all the workers who were staying here for the construction of the Humayun's tomb. So Arab Ki Sarai, you only have the gateway here, and you have a bit of a portion of the wall remaining here, around here, and a bit of the portion remaining around this area. So this would have been a large open area where people would have stayed who were working on the Humayun's tomb. Within this sarai right now, you also have the Afsarwala Mosque and tomb, which is marked number 3 right here. There are other structures here as well. Again, by Intact's listing, you can actually very clearly mark out 15 structures, different structures within this entire complex. Okay, heading to the photos now. Okay, so here you have the photo which I've already shown you. That's the edge of the mosque, the Afsarwala mosque that you have, and this wall has been redone. And if you look at the trees, if you can see, all of these are trees that have been planted on either sides. And please look at the current photos of Humayun's tomb, you'll see how big those trees are. Now, the photo on the top left actually gives you a fair idea about the kind of trees that would have been planted, and you can see it's hardly, the structure is hardly visible. This is from the western entrance gate looking towards Humayun's tomb, and you can see the chhatris that I was mentioning. So 2 chambers in these corners and 2 chambers on the other side. Humayun's buried right in the center. This is the western arch of the central chamber. Sorry. This is a photo from the Babur's tomb that I had mentioned in the map. So from Babur's tomb looking towards Humayun's tomb, this is the southern entrance into Humayun's tomb, the main central chamber that you have. Some other photos, and you can see instead of the gardens, you have, farming sort of a thing happening right here. That is how barren it was, and what a fabulous amount of conservation work that has gone in there. So the Aga Khan Foundation actually partnered with the Archaeological Survey of India, and when India completed its 50 years of independence, that's when the conservation work was gifted to India. It's an ongoing process. The Humayun's tomb has seen a lot of conservation work. The Nizamuddin Basti, the most recent to open up, was the Sundarnagar tomb area, fabulously conserved. Must have a look at them, and they give a really good idea about how these structures would have looked in their heydays. I like to feel that these are also their heydays right now because they've been conserved and they look pretty nice right now. So this is a photo from the book that I have, and you can again see the greenery around here. Behind here would have been the river. All right, coming to my last site for today, which is the Red Fort. Now, before I get down to the Red Fort, I will speak about Shahjahanabad. The Red Fort is a focal point of the city of Shahjahanabad. And Shahjahanabad, some people say is the 13th city, some people say is the 7th city of Delhi, but it is definitely one of the cities of Delhi, which is currently popularly known as Old Delhi. And the reason why it's called Old Delhi is because in the 1930s, New Delhi was inaugurated as the new capital of British India. And because it got the name as New Delhi, its immediate predecessor was called Old Delhi. And it was constructed by Shah Jahan, and he had already finished the construction of the Taj Mahal and all the renovation and upgradation, that whatever he wanted to do at the Agra Fort had already been completed, and then he decides to shift the capital to Delhi. For multiple reasons, Delhi was a very natural option after Agra because of the fact that Delhi had been the capital for many previous rulers, and the climatic condition in Delhi is very similar to that of Agra as well. The other thing is that at the back, what you see, I'm sorry, this is not a very good map, but I'll just mark out what you see at the back here, where my cursor is on the left hand side and now right on top. all of this is one of the branch of the river Yamuna. So this is how close the river Yamuna used to flow. So on the left hand side is the northern direction. It's flowing from north to south. So it's flowing in this direction towards the south. And the river Yamuna in Delhi was also a very important reason. Now, unfortunately, we don't have any written documentation stating why Shah Jahan actually wanted to shift the capital from Agra to Delhi. But couple of logical explanations could be that the weather was similar, the climatic condition was similar, you had the river Yamuna as well. And the reason that I like to believe in the most is the fact that Shah Jahan was an avid lover of architecture. He has patronized some of the most stunning buildings apart from the Taj Mahal, because Taj Mahal takes away all the attention from all the other buildings. But apart from the Taj also, he has constructed a lot of other buildings which are fabulous. And for him to actually shift his capital and name it after himself was an absolutely normal thing to do, because a lot of rulers would do that to sort of live on in the memory of their subjects. And that's the reason why he named his city also as Shah Jahanabad. Shah Jahan's Abad is city, Abadi, like you say for a city or a settlement. So Shah Jahanabad is Shah Jahan's city. Now, Shah Jahan wanted a commercial city and not a residential city, and therefore there were only certain features within the new city which were directly commissioned by Shah Jahan. The first feature is what is showing on your screen right now, which is the Red Fort. And the Red Fort, of course, is the focal point of Shah Jahanabad. There are two streets, important commercial streets. This one here, if you can see my cursor at the lower level of the slide, this is the Lahori Gate, and this is the current entrance into the fort. Just in front of Lahori Gate is what is known as the Chandni Chowk area. So that street is one of the most important commercial streets, which ends at what is known as Fatehpuri Masjid. So going straight down is Fatehpuri Masjid. From the Delhi Gate, and actually just coming out from the Delhi Gate a little bit, up ahead from here towards the south is another street which is known as the Faiz Bazaar. Now, Chandni Chowk and Faiz Bazaar were the two main commercial streets directly commissioned by Shah Jahan. And the third feature, of course, of the city that he directly commissions is the main congregational mosque, which is known as the Jama Masjid currently. Apart from these three features, there was nothing that was directly, if I'm not mistaken, there was nothing that was directly commissioned by Shah Jahan. Everything else comes up by the patronization of his family members, begums, daughters, nobles, and people like that. So all the residential area that comes up is patronized individually. Now coming back to the Red Fort. Now Red Fort was also the seat of the last Mughal emperor, Bahadur Shah Zafar. And if you look at this map, you can see courtyard after courtyard, gardens after gardens, square, the Charbagh pattern everywhere, all around here. Now this map, of course, this section of the map is, of course, it predates 1857, just before 1857, and that's the reason why you can see so many features actually within the Red Fort. The moment the British took charge of the Red Fort post 1857, they actually broke down and made a lot of alterations within the fort. It was a highly congested area. You have to imagine that it is not only the emperor and the royal family who is staying in there, but then there are a lot of other people who are staying inside, extended family, the kitchen, people in the kitchen, and people taking care of the defense, and so on and so forth. And therefore, to declutter, so to say, by the British, they broke down a lot of structures, and this garden was broken down. And if you go into the Red Fort now, this is the Chhatta Chowk area where the Meena Bazaar used to sit. Then this is the Nakar Khana or the drum house. and that is the Diwane arm right here. This pathway that you see will lead you to a row of barracks right here, which have been conserved now by the Archaeological Survey of India, and some of them have been converted into museums. You have a corresponding row of barracks right here as well. So 2 rows of barracks were constructed here to break down all the gardens and the water channels and things like that. You can still see this stepped well inside the Red Fort, and you can also see the remains of this water channel right here. I am not going to go into the details of all the buildings. There are a lot of buildings still that exist right here. This is the platform which had all the important palaces and buildings all along the river Yamuna, and I'm sure you must have read a lot of references about the emperor sitting here and looking at activities on the river right here, on the banks of the river here. So elephants fighting, kushti, wrestling happening and things like that, fairs and so on and so forth. So this was the area that it was happening. I'll take you through some photos. This is the Delhi gate of the Red Fort, and this is where the current parking is. This is where you have the parking. So this has been leveled down, but if you again recollect, you have to drive in. There's a slight incline here to drive into the parking area. So this is the Delhi gate. Both the photos are of the Delhi gate. This is a view of the Red Fort. That's the Red Fort building right here, and you are looking at it from the minaret of the Jama Masjid. So this is the southern minaret. This is the eastern gate of the Jama Masjid, and that's the Red Fort. In the far distance, you can see the river Yamuna as well. That's the Delhi gate of the Red Fort, and this would have been the main entrance for the emperor to enter into the Jama Masjid. This is another view in the same direction, but this one is from on top of the eastern gate of the Jama Masjid, looking towards to Red Fort. This is the Lahori gate of the Red Fort. This is some of the detailing that you have inside the buildings, and this is a water channel, Nehro-Bish as it's called. It runs throughout the palaces in the Red Fort, and this was one of the most important sources for temperature control in all of these buildings. So that's what you have. Now this is an interesting painting actually, specifically the one on the left hand side on top. Both the photos are of the Diwane Khas, but why I really like the photo on the left hand side is because it actually helps you imagine how these buildings would have been when they were being lived in. And a lot of furniture in the Red Fort and any other fort in India at that point in time would have been movable, and that's the reason why you have these canopies right here to provide shades. These are kanats, which if you visit Red Fort right now will realize that the platform is under restoration work, so you can't really climb up, but you can imagine that these kanats, the red color sheets right here, would also have been placed. You can see multiple ropes to hold the canopy, and that's the reason why just at the edge of all the buildings you would always see iron loops or hooks to actually hold on to the canopies, the kanats and the ropes holding it all together. This is another painting which shows you the view from the river. So that's the river, and those are all the palaces that you see at the back right here. That's the Delhi gate of the Red Fort. And with that, I am going to end my presentation here. If you'll just give me a minute, I will re-log in and I'm going to come back to you in video so that I can answer to some of your questions. Thank you so much. Just give me a moment and I will be back.